All right, very good. So I'll get started. My name is Milton Allimadi, and I just wanted to make a slight correction. In the introduction, I'm introduced as Dr. Allimadi, but that's incorrect. I am an adjunct professor at John Jay and at Columbia University, but I'm not Dr. Allimadi. First of all, I am very honored to be a part of this historic gathering. I think it will indeed go down in history as one of the most important recent contributions to our own effort to continue the work that our ancestors, including Kwame Nkrumah, were engaged in, and that is to fight for the total independence and liberation of the African continent. So I want to thank all the organizers for this very historic event. Before I make my own remarks in terms of what we need to do to decolonize the African mind, I want to comment on a few things mentioned in the previous session by Brother Gude Moore. He spoke about the contradictions, the fact that Africa has all the resources that the world uses to create wealth and prosperity. Yet at the same time, Africa is the most impoverished continent in the world. He spoke about the food crises when he was addressing some questions from the audience. And it's ironic that we are in the 21st century discussing what Kwame Nkrumah analyzed very carefully and effectively in his book, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, which, if any listener is not familiar with, I highly, highly recommend. Nkrumah actually wrote about this problem. He wrote about the contradiction of Africa having so much abundant land and yet importing so much food. Many people are not aware that today, as we speak, Africa spends $35 billion with a B every year importing food. Imagine how much we could do with this money, how many farmers we could train into modern agricultural skills, how many hospitals we could build with this money, how many schools we could build with this money. Yet we spend $35 billion to give to countries that are already wealthy and continue to make their wealth off the resources of Africa. So that is one of the contradictions that's contributing to the food crises in African countries today. And of course, there are Africans who have always known the solution, like Thomas Sankara. When Thomas Sankara came to power in Burkina Faso, he said, if you want the best evidence of imperialism, it is to look into your dish. And if your food is imported, that is evidence of imperialism. He changed all that. Within 3 years, Burkina Faso became food self-sufficient. And of course, we know what the solution was for the West. They made sure that Sankara was killed. So I just wanted to point out that many of the issues that we're discussing today have already been analyzed by Kwame Nkrumah, and he provided many of the answers. And in fact, even the Continental Free Trade African Agreement, that in essence is a plan that was outlined by Nkrumah in his same book, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, as well as in Africa Must Unite. So we have to go back and read that book as well and teach more of our people about Nkrumah's lessons. Now, before I get into the meat of my own presentation, we also have to teach and remind not only Africans, but the world that as Czech and Adjunct taught us, had Africans, the people Africans today, because obviously that's not Africa is not even an African term, had we not migrated to other parts of the world about 60,000 to 100,000 years ago, every human being today would be African, would be melanated. And I think this is a very important lesson for the rest of the world to know, but more importantly for Africans to know as well. And many Africans don't know this or forget this or are never taught this. This is very important because I think it goes a long way in dispelling much of the sense of inferiority that so many Africans have internalized. Not surprisingly, it happens over centuries of demonization in Western literature and Western media. And that, of course, is the substance of my own presentation today. It is also the substance of my book, Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. And I will give some examples of the ramifications of that demonization and its impact on Africans on the continent and on Africans in the diaspora. But first, let me go back and start with Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was very optimistic about the prospects of African unity and a United States of Africa. And why was this? In Africa You Must Unite, he analyzed the so-called obstacles that people always presented. The fact that there's so many ethnic groups in Africa, the fact that there's so many different religions and spiritualities in Africa, the fact that we had been shaped into a certain culture and tradition based on our colonial legacies. Even with all these challenges, Nkrumah said the Africans he met in his many engagements with Africans throughout the African continent, he was convinced that there was something special called our Africanness, which meant that we had much more in common than whatever separated us artificially. And that's why he was so confident that the grassroots ultimately would deliver a United States of Africa. And Nkrumah had experience with this because after all, it was the grassroots that delivered independence to Ghana. When Nkrumah first returned to Ghana after his education in the United States and after his stay in Britain, he joined the United Gold Coast Convention. But he realized that that was a party of the elite. They were not really asking for independence. They were asking to be treated much better than they were being treated. They were asking to be treated like, quote unquote, civilized Africans. Nkrumah parted with them and formed the Convention People's Party and started taking his message directly to the masses. And the demand was independence now. And with the support of the masses, Ghana won its independence. Nkrumah became the first prime minister and later became president. So Nkrumah had a confidence that the grassroots would deliver a United States of Africa. I have that same kind of confidence in the grassroots that Nkrumah had, our certain type of Africanness. But in order for us to accomplish that, I really believe we need to decolonize the African mind, which has been conditioned and affected by the centuries of demonization. Where I teach at John Day College, at some point during the semester, a student is going to ask me, Professor, why don't we learn any of this history in high school? Of course, there's a reason why they don't learn any of this history in high school. And by the way, some of these students are students who actually completed secondary school in African countries. So they also pose the same questions. How is it that we don't learn this history in secondary school in African countries? That's the first question. The second and even much more important question that they ask me is this: how is it possible that relatively so few Europeans were able to defeat, conquer, and colonize the entire African continent, given the Africans had overwhelming superiority in the numbers? And of course, sisters and brothers, as many of you know, in the history, we teach them that the Europeans had superior weapons, particularly after 1883, when they invented the Maxim gun, the prototype for the modern machine gun, which gave them advantage in the battleground against Africans, when previously they were almost evenly matched. And that is why previously they'd been unable to conquer and seize territory in Africa. Now that is true, but that's only a part of the explanation. I believe they had a much more powerful weapon, and that was the weapon of propaganda and demonization, which allowed them to pursue the strategy of divide and rule. Because whenever Africans were not divided, they fought the Europeans to a stalemate, or they annihilated the European invaders. And there are many examples throughout the history in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And that is what we need to teach and remind our contemporary youth, that we had many victories and we can secure many more. So let's look at some of the examples. Samora Touré defeated the French in many, many battles until he was ultimately captured in 1898. The Asante Wars, the so-called Asante Wars, when the Asante defeated the British in many, many battles over many, many decades. And then the victory of the Zulu in the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879 in South Africa, when General Khoza annihilated a British army under the command of General Chelmsford, killed 1,000 of the enemy. And then we have the victory of the Mahdi in Sudan, Muhammad Ahmed, the Sufi leader, who defeated General Gordon at the Great Battle of Khartoum in 1885, annihilated his army. And then, of course, we have the mother of African victories against imperialism, when the Ethiopians destroyed an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa on March 1, 1896, led by Emperor Menelik, with Empress Teitu Betu fighting on the front lines alongside her husband and other great Ethiopian generals. Empress Teitu herself had 60,000 men under her command, Empress Teitu herself. And the Italian commanding general, Oreste Baratieri, had promised that he would capture Menelik in a cage and take him back to Italy as a gift to King Umberto of Italy. But instead, General Baratieri had to flee for his life from the battlefield. The Ethiopians killed almost 5,000 soldiers. About 2,000 of them were Eritreans who fought alongside the Italians, because Italy had already annexed Eritrea, so forced some of the Eritreans to fight for them. But almost 3,000 of the dead were Italian soldiers, something unimaginable at that time for Europeans, that 3,000 European soldiers could be killed on an African soil. Two of them were generals of the Italian army. 3,000 Italians were captured, including one general. They were marched back to Addis Ababa and they were forced to work, this time with Africans as the masters. The tables were turned. They were forced to work. It was only about a year later, after Italy paid many millions in reparations, that the Ethiopians freed these captives and allowed them to go back to Italy. These are the many remarkable victories that our youth need to know. Many of our grown-ups are not even aware of this history, of course, and we understand why. Under the many neo-colonial regimes that we have in African countries, this history is avoided. And even in the most recent era, we have many other examples of Africans defeating imperialism that were better equipped with more sophisticated weapons. In the 1970s, in 1974-75, the defeat of Portugal and NATO, defeated by the PAIGC, led by Amilcar Cabral and his compatriots in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. And then we have the victory of the Patriotic Front, Zanu and Zapu, defeating the British, because Ian Smith was just a front for the British in Zimbabwe. We have Frelimo under Samora Machel, and before him, Eduardo Mondlane, defeating again the Portuguese and NATO in Mozambique. We have the MPLA under Dr. Agostinho Neto, defeating NATO and the Portuguese in Angola. We have the mother of recent victories, the Battle of Quito Cuanavao, when our Cuban sisters and brothers, fighting alongside Angola's army, alongside SWAPO, alongside the ANC and other African volunteers, defeating South Africa and the West, because South Africa, after all, during apartheid, was an extension of the West. It still is an extension, but we'll get to that aspect of the story later on. So they were defeated in 1987, and that, of course, set the path to the quick liberation of Namibia and the release of Nelson Mandela and the defeat of formal apartheid in South Africa. These are the histories that our African people need to know, Africans on the continent and Africans in diaspora. Some of us do know the history, but it seems that often we forget this history or forget how its significance can be tied in inspiring the current generation in the contemporary struggle to defeat neocolonialism in Africa. As Walter Rodney used to like saying, the system always comes up with answers. And of course, as we know, one of the biggest answers that the system came up with after formal colonialism ended in Africa was to replace European governors in Africa, essentially with Europeans in blackface, because that, unfortunately, is how many of the African presidents and prime ministers act today. They facilitate European interest in Africa, and by European, of course, I include the United States as well. In order for us really to inspire the youth to challenge this current state of neocolonialism, to challenge empire and their comprador representatives on the African soil, we need to decolonize their minds. The effect of demonization and its impact on Africans and in the diaspora, I'll offer a few examples. Malcolm X knew the impact of this, and I discussed this also in my book. In a speech on February 14, just about a week before he was murdered, this is what Malcolm said, quote, "The colonial powers of Europe, having complete control over Africa, they projected the image of Africa negatively. They projected Africa always in a negative light. Jungles, savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. Why then? Naturally, it was so negative, it was negative to you and me. And you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody to tell us anything about Africa, much less calling us Africans. In hating Africa and hating the Africans, we ended up hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. This internalized inferiorization and self-hate affected sisters and brothers in the African diaspora and on the African continent itself. The history of demonization of Africa is the principal focus of my study and of my book, to show that demonization was part and parcel of the agenda of conquest, exploitation, whether it was during the era of enslavement, whether it was during the era of colonialism, and then, of course, in the modern contemporary era of neocolonialism, both on the African continent and in diaspora as well. So look at the history of representation of Africa and of Blackness. Initially, some of it was influenced by some ignorance as well, curiosity. So for example, when we look at how Herodotus, who wrote his book, The Histories, in the 4th century BC, and he speculated that Black people had black skin because men ejaculated black semen into their women. So somebody could say that was based on gross ignorance at the time. Knowledge and science was not yet that developed, because after all, to his credit, Herodotus did inform his contemporaries that the Egyptians, ancient Egypt, Kemet, were in fact African Black people. To his credit, we give him that. So we might say the suggestion that black semen accounted for the black skin was largely based on ignorance. But there did come a time when demonization and racist representations of Africa became part of a philosophy, a Western philosophy, to make the case that Africans were inferior to Europeans. And that was to justify, of course, exploitation, including on plantation slavery economies. And Walter Rodney made that distinction, that if we look at racism that existed prior to that era, we could say that kind of racism might be based on personal animus, personal hatred, personal ignorance, but it was not part of a systemic system which was put in place during the expansion of global capital, where race became an important factor in how access to resources are defined, in how race becomes an important factor and in terms of what role that an individual plays in the economic system itself. So therefore, a racist ideology or philosophy had to arise to make that justification. And that is a vast distinction, institutional racism, than all other forms of racism that existed prior to that era. And that is where the media, the literature, and later on the newspapers, the magazines, television, and film became a very important weapon in this propaganda war used by the West against African peoples. So let's look at some of the earliest depictions or representations of Africa in major publications such as the New York Times, for example. One of the earliest editorials in the New York Times referring to Africa is one from July 1877. So initially, the article starts off by saying that Africans are people that are being tortured and in pain because they were a mix between a crocodile and a hippopotamus. That's I'm sorry about that. It's so nonsensical that it's almost comical. Were it not sad at the same time, because it's actually making an argument for genocide against Africans. So it said Africans were mixed between the crocodile and the hippopotamus, so therefore they were in pain. And what would be a solution? The solution was for England to colonize Africa. So first you have the demonization, and then you have the justification for economic exploitation. So that's an editorial from 1877. So let's jump forward to the 20th century. When we start finding articles in the New York Times from the 1920s making a case for the creation and promotion of the apartheid state in South Africa, also depicting Africans as inferior to Europeans, as not being able to embrace the sophisticated European civilization. And therefore, that's why they needed to have a segregated system in South Africa with a civilization appropriate for Europeans on the one hand, and another appropriate for Africans on the other hand, without explaining why it was that the Europeans were enjoying all the gains from the profits from the mines and other resources, and Africans were providing the labor and suffering. That was, as far as the New York Times was concerned, was an aside issue. So you had that Times article quoting officials, the white officials in South Africans, saying that giving European type civilization to Africans was the same as giving a razor to a monkey. And the same quote and argument you find in other New York Times articles pertaining to Africa during the colonial era with respect to other European entities that were governing African colonies. And that, of course, was before apartheid finally became official policy in South Africa in 1948. And now, if you look back, you'll see a similarity between these depictions in newspapers, in the New York Times in particular, with the earlier writings about Africa, which was by the so-called explorers who went to Africa, these trespassers who went there and renamed major lakes, rivers, mountains, and other monuments that already had African names. So let's look at one of them before we come back to the newspapers again. Samuel Baker, who went to East and Central Africa, and he wrote in his book, Albert Nyanza, in 1866. Look at the similarity between the demonization in his book and in the New York Times editorials from 1877. Baker wrote that Africans should not be compared to the noble character of the dog. And then he asked some Africans to guide him to a lake so that he could discover it. And he went and he quote unquote discovered Lake Albert. Luther Nzige, he changed it to Lake Albert after the name of the husband of Queen Victoria. And of course, you know also, prior to him, another fellow European had already come and allegedly discovered Lake Victoria, which was called Nam Lolwe in the Luo language, changed that to Lake Victoria. So after he demonized the Africans as not being comparable to the noble character of the dog, in the same text, he then goes ahead and makes the argument for England to come and colonize Africa and benefit from the immense commerce and trade that would be available. So you see how the New York Times simply picked that racist depiction of the trespasser so-called explorer, and started propagating that image of Africa on the pages of the New York Times. So now we discussed the 1920s. Let's move to the 1950s. This was when Kenyans were fighting to regain their stolen land that had been stolen by the British. They named their guerrilla movement a very specific name because they knew what they wanted. It was called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. The British demonized them as the Mau Mau. Mau Mau is not an African word, but the word Mau Mau evokes that image of African barbarity. In fact, the newspaper accounts in Britain and then in the United States, particularly in Time magazine and the New York Times, simply duplicated the British propaganda and said the war was because of an African hatred toward white people, African bewilderment toward white civilization, and that they were being led by witch doctors in conjunction with communism, communist inspired agitators. In other words, the Kenyans had to be inspired by communists to know that it is wrong for them to have been displaced from their land and that their parents had been killed and ethnically cleansed when the land was seized from them. And that was a depiction in the New York Times and Time magazine articles, which I also analyze and I include in my book. And then let's look at the next major struggle around that same period, the struggle for independence in African countries. And once again, the portrayal in US media reflected the British propaganda that Africans were unworthy of independence. After all, we'd already been told much earlier that giving, quote unquote, Western civilization to Africans, as if, in any case, as if that is the default civilization, when in fact, civilization originated in Africa. So I digress for a minute, but sometimes it's important to digress. Kemet, Egypt, existed more than 5,000 years ago. And even more recent kingdoms, ancient Gali, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, existed well before the founding of new states, such as England, which did not come into existence until the 10th century. Africa had a university at Sankore in the year 900, a whole century before Oxford came into existence. And of course, Harvard just came around yesterday in the 1600s. So that is why it is so remarkable. And you see how cleverly the Western media has been successful in wiping out and eliminating all that history and saying that any advanced history and society is Western.